right, so let's begin. What is this agenda about? What are board structures and operating procedures? Why are they important? What are the signs of inadequate structures and procedures, or where there's challenges around them? Why do they occur? What can be done about them? And how have boards changed in response to assessments of them within the context of board effectiveness? So I want to start with a quote by my colleague, Professor David Renz at the University of Kansas City, Missouri. And what he says, to be clear about this, is that governance is a function and a board is a structure. It's a legal structure, it's a colonial structure, but is a structure. Within the sort of context of board effectiveness, how do structures and procedures fit? And this is the first influence that we're going to talk about in this Research to Practice series. So we started the series with the governance process. So the board's due diligence and fiduciary roles and responsibilities, the board's role and responsibilities in planning, the board's role in performance assessment, the board's role in fundraising and resource development. So we covered those in the previous sessions. Now we're covering these other influences, and these are factors that are associated with board effectiveness and key influences on how well the board governs. So I sort of want to situate this conceptually so you get an idea that this is an influence on governance, and it's a dimension of board effectiveness in itself. And so it's one of the sections that's covered in the board checkup. So where does this fit in terms of governance? Well, it falls really within the board's fiduciary governance role around ensuring that the structures and procedures exist to ensure the organization advances its purpose, it doesn't drift, and its compliance with laws and regulations. So that's sort of how this fits in terms of modes of governance, theoretically. And then from an institutional, I'm just going to let someone else in here, from an institutional theoretical perspective, last meeting we went over each dimension has different theory, assumptions, and theory that explain what effectiveness is within it. And so from this perspective, the assumptions are that the interests of the organization are advanced when the behaviors and practices of the board align with the external environment, and that those structures and procedures increase alignment with practice standards associated with effectiveness. So this is sort of the assumptions of the theory behind this perspective and how it relates to effectiveness. Now, let's talk about, I think I want to just skip over, I'm going to skip over that one for a second because I've divided them up, but let's talk about what they are first before we get into some of the challenges. So we have board structures and procedures. Let's start with the procedures. So those are really the rules by which the board operates, and they're specified in the Constitution and bylaws. These are legally required, and they vary by jurisdiction. They reflect that history of the organization and the board in which that corporation was registered, and they can vary by where that location is. For example, I'm on a board in New York, but it was incorporated in Massachusetts. And so the board really has to comply with two sets of laws for the state of Massachusetts and the state of New York. And so that for, when laws started changing and the organization moved, this became a bigger issue for the board in terms of whether it was compliant or not. It also includes these procedures also include terms of office for board members and officers and committees of the board. They provide a mechanism for renewal of the board and officers, and they define the membership and authority of members, quorums for meetings, and matters that must be put to a vote of the membership. So these are important documents. They also include, procedures also include position descriptions that define the authority of board members and the competencies and qualifications to carry those positions out. Could also include a board manual that encompasses many of these documents that provide a source of history and information for new board members and renewal for existing board members. They can include things like definitions and terms, procedures, and key policies, governance, accountability, document retention, conflicts of interest. Again, they may vary by what's required by jurisdiction, and then those position descriptions. Having one doesn't assume that people are aware of them and that they have read them, but they are important to as a guide for the board, especially when there are issues before it that it needs to deliberate. Procedures can also encompass support for the board in terms of helping it with its governance work. So recording, coordinating, and could also include technology that the board has access to facilitate this, or even store many of these documents. In terms of structures then, we're talking about the size of the board, board offices, and committees. So the size of the board can help the board access resources. It can help it become more representative, becomes a link to the environment, and helps it carry out its governance role and responsibilities, whatever it may be. And of course, this may vary according to whether the board is all volunteer, a working board, whether it's a policy-only governance board, and whether it's sort of a hybrid of both of those. Structures as offices are structures, and these are the leadership functions and administrative functions of the board reflected in key leadership positions, chair and vice chair, treasurer, and does require clear descriptions and training for those offices. Committees can also vary depending on the board and organization, what type it is. They can be task groups, policy, working, standing, or special projects. So we're going to cover more of this. I'm just sort of defining them here. And again, they vary by type of organization and the model of governance. And if you're curious about that, in the very first Research to Practice webinar, we went through the different models of governance, and you may want to revisit that. I'm not going to go into it today. So why do boards experience problems with these things, with structures and procedures? I'm going to open it up to you now for a minute. Why do you think that is, or do they, in your experience? Feel free to unmute. Any theories about this? Why boards experience challenges? Okay, well, let's look at some of them. So it could be just that they haven't been updated. So they were created when the organization was incorporated, and they haven't been reviewed or updated since. It also could be that the board doesn't change them as the organization professionalizes and grows. And so maybe they started out as a working board and now sort of moved into a hybrid function, but the structures and procedures hadn't changed to reflect that new stage of development. There could be a lack of knowledge and awareness of the influence that board structures and procedures have on the governance process, and have also on the behavior of the board and how that can inhibit the board. There could be a culture that exists within the board that may be informal, and these are structures and procedures are all about formality and organization, and so that culture may value informality, or it may see these as a barrier or unnecessary to governance. Could also be that the leadership of the chair or CEO or a group or a core group within the board affects how these are carried out according to their knowledge and skills or the values that they place on them. Or it could be that the board's simply unaware and most boards that are at risk for this are those that don't assess their performance and self-regulate to change themselves. These are the challenges that we've identified that are assessed in the checkup. And you can see that they span everything from the bylaws to the policy manual to the size of the board, to those job descriptions, admin support, access to tools and technology to facilitate the work, and a lot of questions about committees and chairs and contribution. So these are the challenges. And do you think we've missed any in here? And I'm going to share with you what the thousands of board members have indicated in terms of which are most salient. Any that we've missed, do you think? Okay, well, let's see what they are. All right, so I've highlighted them in this dashboard from most perceived to be most to least problematic. And at the very top, the most problematic are committees, members that don't contribute very much or don't have enough experience for them to be functional, or they're unclear about their responsibilities, the committee and authority. Others then the next sort of set are around those procedures, the bylaws, the policy manual, job descriptions mainly, or committees that aren't really useful anymore, and then lack of use of the tools that the board has access to. And then the least problematic is admin support for the board, access to tools and technology, and the size of the board. So and then how do structures and procedures fit sort of overall in terms of the challenges that boards face based on the perceptions of those who have assessed their board's effectiveness? It's sort of in the middle, not highly problematic as fundraising and resource development is, but still challenging for boards. So let's talk about what to do about this. What can boards do, and what have they done in response to these challenges? So, it's a good idea, especially now, and we're seeing this sort of globally, different countries and different states and provinces reviewing their laws that tend to be really outdated in terms of not-for-profit law. And so many changes have, new legislation has been enacted, and within the legislation are new regulations that require, many of them have implications for boards and governance and structures and procedures. So, for example, compliance with the law, you're going to see that in the state of New York, boards need to have a conflict of interest policy and procedure, and how that links in with the documentation and minutes and recording of those conflicts. Similarly, audit committees, and there are regulations around the composition of those committees, and those being defined as independent directors serving on them who are at arm's length from finance with the organization. So these are all specified in those regulations. It's a good idea to check as you're going through renewal, what those changes are, and making sure that any updates need to reflect that for compliance purposes. And so, but also not just beyond compliance, because we've been talking about compliance and board effectiveness, and we know from the research that the boards that change for compliance purposes only tend not to change their behavior and practices. They will follow the regulation, but they may not make changes in alignment with best practices. So some of the other suggestions for change are unique to the board and organization, what the history is of that organization, the type of organization, and the needs of the board. And so here's just a list of some bullet points about membership, voting. These are things that tend to be fairly, that can vary, and not a one-size-fits-all. There need to be quorums, what has to be decided by the membership, for example, how to amend the bylaws, what kinds of decisions can the board make, and can they make them electronically, and so on. But whatever, so some are in compliance with regulations and some are unique to the organization. And but whatever is change really should be reviewed by a lawyer to make sure that they are compliant and in the best interests of the corporation. On the manual side, having a history of the organization and its purpose, and is that reflected in, is that purpose adequately stated from the bylaws, and are people aware of that? I think that I was at a board retreat last weekend, And we all brought our bylaws. We're an association with different branches throughout the region, and we all have parts of our purpose that align, but we all had different purposes, and were we aware of that? And how do we work together to advance our purpose but build our relationships? And that was one of the things that we were talking about. But everyone, we did bring a manual, which all the documents that were in it were available online. They were on our website, but really nobody really knew how to interpret them, make use of them. And so we compiled them in a meaningful way, and discussed their implementation. So that's what a good use of a manual that sort of becomes a Bible for the organization, and a handbook that can be really useful to existing, as I said, and new members. It should state how the board governs. So what's unique to that organization? Are we a working board? Are we a policy-only board? What's effectiveness in this mode of governance? Who are the officers? What are the offices? What's the authority within them? And all of this becomes really useful, especially to new members. And then around what kind of supports exist. And maybe they haven't been, and maybe this is a conversation to have about what could help to be compliant with, let's say, document retention. Are minutes, is there a problem keeping accurate records of the minutes, and how to record conflicts, and how to adequately state motions and the results of votes around them, and so on. And so there could be the board, of course, while they're responsible for these things, there may be difficulty in compliance with them. And this is an area where some support can be provided, and I put technical support transcripts in Zoom meetings, for example, can be created, and that can help with minutes and meeting regulations around document retention. All right, so any questions on the procedural pieces or comments? Okay, well, let's move on then to structures. So board size is a big question. You know, how big should this board be? And really, there is no empirical research that says such a size of board is the most effective, associated with effectiveness. It varies. But there are a number of paradoxes to consider when thinking about board size. So the larger the board, or the greater the number of directors, the more difficult it is to provide functional and meaningful roles for those directors. And we know that functional inclusion is associated with board effectiveness. And so you want whatever size of the board you have, you want those members to have functional roles. The greater the number of directors, the more time is going to be needed for board meetings, perhaps, to arrive at, to deliberate issues and to decide them and vote on them, especially if the board has uses consensus decision making, where the board really needs to reach consensus on a decision. So that's going to take more time. Conversely, the smaller the board, the fewer the directors, the more difficult it's going to be to get a valid representation of the views of the community that the board and organization serves. And so it might be more efficient, but it may not be effective in bringing all of those voices to the table. And along the lines of smaller the number of directors, the more difficult it is to do the work of the board, to meet the demands of the governance function. I'm seeing this with another board here where the board has created a new strategic plan, and it's aligned its committee to monitor that plan, committees of the board. The board only has 7 members, and so it was struggling with monitoring and within committees, and then meeting as a whole of a board. One of the solutions that board decided was to meet every other month. It only had to meet 4 times a year, and then to meet in committee every other month. So the committees then would meet 1 month, and then they would bring issues and action items to the board the next month. And that seems to be working well. And that seems to be a structural treatment to that problem. Solutions, but there can be other solutions for board size issues. For example, if you don't want to increase the size of the board, you can create advisory boards and committees with non-board members who have some functional expertise to bear on that committee. And that actually becomes a good breeding ground for succession planning and who your next board members may be. So they can cross-train in these sort of voluntary roles, and then that gives them some experience and to develop leadership competency and some knowledge and history of the organization. Engaging the board members in functional committees or individual roles on the board. So for example, maybe some of your board members, and I've seen this on another board that I'm working with, where some lawyers, for example, on that board may provide individual advisory roles that aligns with their experience. And outside of that, some of them have said to me they really question their role on the board, and that their contributions outside of that. So it may be that you have certain people on the board for a certain function, and you may engage them in a different way. And if you can't, I mean, you may not have to bring everybody on. Another board that I'm working with is obtaining the kind of expertise that it needs, that the board used to have, but lost some key individuals, and they're really hard to replace by contracting with them and bringing them on in very to provide expertise to inform decisions in a very specific role as contractors. So those are some ways that you can mitigate some of the challenges that you see with the size of the board, and choose solutions that really do address the problem. Some of the other structural changes could be with the offices themselves, and just defining those roles and those responsibilities associated with them, and then providing training and development within them. And for those who fill the position, I was meeting with a board chair yesterday who, when she came onto the board, she had a 10-minute phone call and she never saw the person again. And she was really challenged in trying to get up to speed on her role. And of course, everyone who comes onto board wants to do a good job. So formalizing training and development for officers is a good solution to this, to a structural problem. Succession planning as well. So choosing officers who are going to sort of ascend into the role. So vice chairs who will then ascend into the chair position, and giving lots of thought to that. And again, providing support for those people and positions so that they can meet the demands of them. I'll give you an example of my own experience. I'm chair of a governance committee on a board, and we were really struggling with, we had a lot of issues we were engaged in. We were really struggling coordinating meetings, getting minutes of meetings done, and moving those to the board. And so one of the solutions was to have an admin support from the organization work with us to provide that, and we've been more effective since then. Committees as well. As you saw, committees are one of the perceived greatest challenges in this area on boards. So being clear about which committees you have and why you have them, what's their function, and deciding whether they're still relevant or not. Some of the, some of them are often taken for granted, like an executive committee, and some of the criticism of executive committees could be that they are governing for the board. The issues come to the executive committee, they deliberate, and then when it gets to the board, they simply rubber stamp and never really get involved. So they really do have to be, the executive committee really does have to examine its influence on governance and perhaps ensure that that kind of challenge doesn't emerge. Again, there's certain committees that are required by law now, and I put an asterisk around audit in New York, for example. Finance, planning, nominating, it's all going to depend on the organization. Many boards now are consolidating nominating and board development into the governance committee function, and that redefining governance committee as responsible for ensuring the board's self-assessment and development. And so it can encompass a much broader scope of its work. So reflecting on that, policy committees can study policy issues and bring those back to the board. Working committees, again, those are focused on implementation of policy or supporting the work, the operational work of the organization, depending on what kind of organization it is. There are risks associated with working committees. Another board had so many that it wasn't that its committees were all operational, and there was very little governance going on. And so when we reflected, sort of did an audit of the committees, we realized that the board was at risk on the governance side of meeting its own, of monitoring itself and its own responsibilities. And so redefined some of those and became clear that the working committees were operational in nature, and they were to assist the organization that didn't have the resources or the technical capacity to actually implement some of the policies that the organization made. Task groups can come and go, and they can be sort of time and task bound around specific needs, like searching for a CEO or developing a strategic plan if it's not a policy board. Terms of reference, many times they don't exist or they need updating for not just for the board, but these committees, clarifying what the committee's purpose, authority, composition, how meetings and decisions will be made. All right, so Here are some of the changes, and these are quotes from boards after they assessed performance. What were some of the changes that they made in this area? Boards, the workload changed, the workload adjusted, and new committees were formed, and some were dropped. So these are changes that one board of an organization made. Another change, boards, most required board governance policies have been updated and approved. Monitoring and review strategies are under development. Board committees have developed work plans and output is monitored. Information systems are still underdeveloped. Here's another one, redoing board committees and writing terms of reference and policies to new format and consistency. They're separating board and management policies. Again, that gets back to the example I just made about being clear on what's governance and what's operational. Another one, we have undertaken a thorough review of all board policies and continue to review them. Committees are more structured with annual work plans. All right, these, if you can see, so of all the changes, and that was just a few of them, of all the changes that boards have made, you can see in this word cloud, the larger the word, the higher the frequency of change. So you're going to see the most changes that boards make. Again, the issue came up around committees is around board committees and being clear about governance. Policies comes up. Review is another frequently used word. Updating the bylaws is another one, and so on. And I'm going to show you here, these are all changes that boards have made following performance assessment. And you can see structures have improved, lots of improvement around the executive committee being more engaged with the board, and governance committee ownership over board development and functioning, and recommendations coming to the whole of board for board deliberation. And that's just a sample of some of the changes that are made. If you are interested in the subject of board effectiveness, we would appreciate it if you would subscribe to this podcast, share it with others in your organization and in your network, and leave a review, especially if you liked it. Feel free to leave comments and questions about the topic explored in this podcast or boards of directors that you would like us to explore in future podcasts. And if you have suggestions for me, please feel free to reach out using the contact information. Thanks for joining us.